Yep. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hopefully, some parts of the planet, it's not yet good night. This is Shiv Someshwar from Columbia University, class 2 of our foundations course, which is an MDP, includes an MDP global classroom. So welcome all of you. Today I have the distinct pleasure of inviting our most distinguished, extremely distinguished Professor Patrick Paul Walsh from University College Dublin, where he is a PhD, where he's a Professor of International Development Studies with a PhD from London School of Economics in economics. We were actually fortunate to have Paul last year at Columbia University, where he was a visiting professor and senior advisor to SDSN, that's the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He also is currently the chair of the Academic Steering Committee of the Global Association of MDPs, and many of you who are participating in this course, of course, are from the MDP programs. So you have any issues on academic rigor, make it more rigorous, less rigorous, you should talk to Paul. Okay? And he extensively participated last year at the UN as part of the intergovernmental negotiations. This was he kind of followed the post-2015 negotiations, which is a major platform for intergovernmental as well as stakeholder negotiations. And SDSN benefited hugely from his presence and expertise there all of last year. So really glad to have Paul come and talk to us about ending poverty and inclusive economic growth. Paul?
Hello. Thank you, Shiv. So welcome everybody. So obviously welcome everybody in the room, but I'd like to say a special welcome obviously to all the MDPs around the world, but particularly my class in Dublin. I think they're looking with Conor Galvin there. So hello. So what I want to do, if I can remember the steps. Is this correct? Yeah. No.
The green one.
Okay. So Chev did want me to say something a little bit about my background, because obviously as an economist, I am a little bit of a prisoner or a reflection in my own mirror of my own training. But I started off as an industrial economist, and you will see that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is very much embedded in that sort of industrial development background. But I also moved on to look at issues like social security. So very much looking at what I call the interaction of product and labor markets. And these days, I've been forced into looking at the interaction of what we call the economic, social, and environmental side as well, right? Because this is the integrated approach that we've to take on board from in the new in what we call the new 2030 agenda. So just two things I wanted to say briefly. One is as most of the MDPs will know, we have a very big conference here next week. So just before the actual UN summit, we have an international conference on sustainable development that's jointly run by SDSN and also by the Global Association of MDPs. Hopefully you know, but this is free to all MDP students and students in general right across. So it's going to be a very big youth conference, but it has a star-studded lineup right the way through the program. And if you can't come to New York, please look at the webcast, because the Kapuscinski Lecture Series, which is run by the UNDP and the European Commission, has actually sponsored the webcasting. And you can catch all the planetaries, the big sessions actually live.
Paul, just a quick one. We're actually pulling in some programs that cannot access Google Hangout through Skype. So just a minute.
Yeah.
And for them, we'll also PDF your presentation and send it, because you can't do a screen share on Skype. So sorry about that. Yep. Any questions? No, with this, it doesn't work both. Yeah. Right here.
video call.
Yep, that's it. Great.
Hello, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, now you're on. Can you mute them?
Finally.
No, they have
Uh,
to do it for themselves.
Can you also mute the microphone at your end, please? Lovely. Thank you. Paul?
So first is to encourage everybody to go to the actual conference over the 2 days. And it's not just these star-studded plenary sessions. There's also 120 papers given by MDP and MDP staff as well, which are even better to go to, right? After those 2 days, we actually have the UN. So the thing I wanted to emphasize though is please join us on the webcast for the plenary sessions through the Kapuscinski portal, okay? Maybe we'll send that on later to the actual groups, just exactly the address of the portal. Obviously after the conference, we have the actual summit, okay? And the document, hopefully you're all aware of, because I'm going to, because I actually sat through the whole negotiations from what we call, from what's called stakeholding to declarations, to outcome documents, to revisions, etc., to finally a document transforming our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The thing I want you to look at on this slide is this portal here. Okay, so the United Nations have kindly, for the UN system and all stakeholders, the 52 elements of the UN system and all the different stakeholders are supposed to be in partnership for this SD project. They've created a platform for us where I've put up there, the Sustainable Development Knowledge Platform. And there you will see various buttons and portals to various issues. And none of them are innocent, right? In the sense that there is something very interesting and big behind each of the issues that are up there. So when you look at it, you might just go, what is the Global Sustainable Development Report? What is the Technology Facilitation Mechanism? All of these things are really very important, and you should start logging in and understanding what they're there and how they're going to evolve, etc. Okay. So just very briefly, before I get into the nature of the topic or the lecture plan, I do think if we go back a few years ago, even into the global classrooms a few years ago when we were just looking at the MDGs, I mean, most of us would not have imagined that we would see the document that is on the table in September, right? So to say that this is a success, this is a huge success that this has happened, right? I know there's been criticisms of the Factor 17 goals, such a comprehensive, such a detailed document, but the bottom line is that there is, heads of states will be, the 192 heads of states will be signing this declaration with the 17 goals and the 169 targets, plus a framework for implementation and a framework for monitoring and review, okay? Some people are a little disappointed that in some ways maybe we're not going to be up and running to implement the whole thing in January, and there is a lot of work to do on indicators. Finance people thought that the ADIS was a failure, but in a way, it's a very comprehensive framework for thinking about financing for the future. We have a lot of work to do with institutions, both at government level and NGO and the UN system, etc. A lot of work to do on science policy interfaces, natures of the technologies, training young professionals. The MDP is doing that, has been doing it since 2007, but there's only 6,000 of you guys. We need a lot more young professionals going in, supporting NGOs and nation states and governments in the UN on this thing. And then the last thing is partnerships. It's a great idea, and this is something I'm going to focus on this lecture. It's a great idea that civil society, academia, private sector and government sit down and do this together in a multi-stakeholder partnership at all levels, both in communities, cities, nation states, regions and global, but we still have to figure out how to do this and how to do it effectively. All right. But one thing that Jeffrey Sachs would be pleased about is that there was a push particularly in the preamble, to market these goals like a little bit more simply. Rather than having the 17 goals, which we'll have a look at, it's nice that we have the 3 Ps that I call them: planet, people, and prosperity. And in a way, this is the way that's looked at is this is definitely an integrated approach, right? What we want to do is to integrate the way we look at economies with societies and with the environment or with the planet. And it will be underpinned by 2 very important things. If you like, the key instruments is peace. You need peace as a necessary condition to do anything. And then one of the key instruments to drive the 3 Ps will be partnership, the multi-stakeholder partnership. Okay, and there is no doubt within the preamble and the declaration, we have this view, very integrated vision for the SDGs, which is very much integrating across the pillars of economic, society, and environment. Okay. One thing, though, is that when we go into the goals themselves and we go into the targets, there does seem to be a reversal back to a little bit of demarcation and a little bit of into your silos and into the topics where there isn't as much integration across these 3 pillars as you might like. Okay. The answer by the co-facilitators on this in the press conference afterwards was, if you take the 169 targets as a package, a holistic package, you get everything, right? If you start going into individual targets, maybe you can go back, you're going back into silos a little bit, okay? But I'm going to show you this in terms of an analysis of economic development, okay? The plan for this lecture, so I want to say a little bit about just from like what are the key differences very quickly about from MDGs to SDGs, right? And in all, I'll do that. I'll just say, then I'm going to do a theoretical, a theoretical framework for you. Then I'm just going to take a very traditional approach to industrial or economic development, and obviously the disconnects are created with social, environmental outcomes. And finally, I'm just going to look at this new agenda where we want an integrated approach. And particularly the question I'm going to ask is, can we really have this fairly standard, or, you know, it's written there in the targets, can we have an approach to capital formation, economic growth that really will hit the targets on the social environmental side? And in particular, I mean, will it lead to a situation where we're leaving no one behind, right? Is this really going to be a comprehensive social agenda, right? If we do everything on the economic side, which is suggested in the 2030 agenda. And the other thing, that on the environmental side, are we going to hit planetary boundaries, right? In a sense that if we drive the policies that are here in all the targets, are really we going to remain within planetary boundaries, right? So in other words, I get a sense that we are putting efficiency first. We're all going to augment it by being socially inclusive and environmentally responsible. But will that be enough to reach down to the poorest of the poor and leave no one behind? Will it be enough to do the transformative changes that we need so that we don't basically go beyond the planetary boundaries that are defined to protect the Earth and existence of humans on the Earth, okay? Because it is, most people, it's the old story about if you're focusing on the economic side, how can that be consistent with social and environmental issues, okay? So the first, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to compete, after the theory, you'll see, I'm going to compete a little bit about the role of government in this, right? In the sense that, can this agenda be sorted by companies and households on their own, where a government creates in a kind of enabling environment, or do we need heavy-handed government, okay? So I'm going to just create this like a more laissez-faire situation. What can government do to let households and people do their thing and maybe achieve the goals? And there are ways that that can happen. Or, unfortunately, I'm a European, so I'm going to be pushing a much bigger role for the government in this, in terms of intervention and sort of policies. And I'm going to specifically, Seb has asked me to look at the economic goals in particular. And so my take on this is that I'm going to look at a lot of this through the lens of how I look at the corporates, at the companies, and what they can do, or what we can do in terms of government regulation or incentives to make them behave, right? To be more socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. And the last bit is that I will talk a little bit about multi-stakeholder partnerships. A lot of you will say there has been evidence of these working, and I would say in certain areas and projects like health in certain communities. But what I'm going to look at is I want to see, can this work in the mainstream of governments and society and companies, right? So I want to take it out of the project base and into more macro or more kind of nation state level, whether these partnerships can be helped run to achieve the goals. Finally, then, we'll have a look at what I call proofing the goals and targets. We'll have a look at goal 1, 8, 9, 10, 12. So 8, 9, and 8 and 9 are very economic goals. Like, to me, I'm going to make a case that these are really about companies. We're going to look at goal 10, which is about equality, and goal 12, which is the sustainable production and consumption, okay? So in a sense, again, most of them, my interpretation is related to the legal entity, the corporate, right? And how consistent this is with ending poverty, particularly leaving no one behind, and not breaking planetary boundaries. This is the issue that we'll talk about at the end, okay? So the MDG project, it's still, we have to remember, the MDG project is not over. It's not over till the end of December. And I still think there is time for reflection and review just on the successes of whether the success and failures of the project. But the key thing about the MDGs was they were what I would call social targets. They were social indicators, right? So going back in time when we did development, and this is for good reason, we basically collected data from companies because we did it with surveys. You know, in any country, the amount of companies is a lot less than households, right? So we got into a habit of looking at the value of goods and services and employment and looking at a lot we call core economic indicators, right? And they were, if you like, the thing that people based development on. Then with the advent of computing and household data, we realized actually we can monitor economies on the basis of household outcomes. So we can look at nutrition, we can look at health, we can look at education, you know, we can look at access to clean water, sanitation, etc. And these basically came from surveying households and building up what we call social indicators, right? So most of the MDG project for me was telling us to get away from the economic indicators. Let's try, the human development movement, let's look at the social indicators as well and make sure they're as good. They become, you know, a good, for follow-up and for monitoring of development, that the social indicators become important, in particular, hunger, education, health, and so on and so forth. But they were very much driven from a household perspective. There were household indicators, national aggregates. Finance was predominantly, the way we thought about it, is that these issues were fundamentally concentrated into developing countries, right? So when we thought about financing, we thought about how we get money into the developing countries, and a lot of it was through overseas development aid or foreign aid from the OECD, and that's why it came in. And the duty bearer in this sort of project, implicitly, because of the national way we measured the national indicators, was the national governments, particularly the recipient countries, right? So for a lot of people, this is what the MDGs were about. What's interesting about the SDGs is that we are now, it's a big comeback for economic indicators, right? So we've held the social indicators. So we still have the hunger, the health, the education, gender empowerment, clean water access, etc. So we have, if you like, the MDG social indicators, and they're more refined and they're more interesting, but we've added new indicators. And the ones we've added are economic ones, right? And these are the ones we're going to focus on today, particularly the thing about good jobs and economic growth, innovation, R&D, and infrastructure. And then we're going to see how they're augmented with this or income inequalities, how we look at social outcomes here and how they're augmented with sustainable development and consumption, production and consumption issues, right? So this is the, 12. So it's 8, 9, 10, and 12. Then we have environmental ones, which are all new. And then we have peace and justice. And then we have the global partnership structure, which is new, okay? But the argument here that I'm making is that the economic indicators were not actually in the MDGs, right? It was as if, you know, that is the paradigm that everybody's operating under. Everybody wants, you know, agribusiness move up the value chain, wants small businesses to happen, wants good jobs, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to be the paradigm that's driving economies, but we didn't mention them. What we want to do, yeah, but we want to keep an eye on people's nutrition, on their health and their education, on their access to sanitation and water, and that's what was the focus of the MDG, right? Now we're being explicit about the economics, right? And in particular, this is coming from the G77 because they just see that they want to grow. They want economic growth, right? And now we have those goals as well. And finally, we also have the environmental goals, right? About water, the air, the water, the land, basically, right? We have the environmental goals and targets as well, right? So the question that I'm going to ask here is that I want an integrated approach on both the economic, the social, and environmental dimensions. The goals, to me, have fragmented them out, right? Demarcated them out. And we'll see that even within the targets that they even go more aggressive, right? So the economic goals are real hardcore economic goals, right? And I want to see how, if you take this as a holistic vision, the 169 targets, it works. But if you just say, our country is just going to target goal 8 and, you know, we're not really that bothered with the others, you'll see it doesn't work, right? And this is the way we look at the lecture. So I know this is a little bit of, what's the word? This is just me with a red pen, right? Or whatever, you know. But again, I'm thinking goal 1, hopefully this is the overarching goal, just like it was in the MDGs, that at the end of the day, if you look at the nature of ending poverty in all its forms, it can come from environmental damage, it can come from economic losses, it can come from health issues, you know. So this is a pretty holistic, like that must be our overarching goal, okay? Then we have what I call the household goals. They're basically MDG pluses. They're basically those targets for houses, and we want to end hunger, healthy lives, and inclusive education and gender, all this sort of stuff. Water management, and now we have this like energy and affordable energy that you know, households should be entitled to this as well, the use of modern energy sources. Okay, but this is all household indicators, and it's, to me, it's the MDG, it's a social indicator. These are all social indicators or household indicators. The red are company, they're targeted at your industrial base in your company. So it's about promoting economic growth, resilience in your infrastructures, and we'll see then about the nature of inequality and sustainability in terms of your environment, in terms of their consumption production patterns. But if you look at the targets and you read about these goals, it's clear we're thinking about companies, the corporate, right? And how they are going to fit into this agenda, and that's the focus of this lecture. Finally, the green are the more what I call environmental, right? Or like dealing with urban slums, dealing with climate change, with the oceans, with the forests, etc. And then finally, 16 and 17 are what I call the instruments, like looking at peace, you know, the key thing, the peace and the partnership, and how that's fleshed out, okay? So I put them into the gray. So I see them as more instrumental, right, rather than being kind of targets in themselves. But they're important, they're governance, and they're important. And if you go back to Rio 20 Plus, this is exactly what the matrix that was there. They talked about this economic pillar, which is there, the social pillar, the environmental pillar, and the governance pillar. So those four things have survived, and that's where they are.
Well,
yeah.
Not too far from the microphone.
Not too far from the microphone. Okay. Now I think I'll go back and I'm going to talk to you. I need to look at people for this. So hopefully, so it's one. No. Is there no camera? Was there no picture?
No, it says it's enabled. No, I think it.
People can see me, can they?
Yeah, I think so.
They can hear me?
We can hear you.
If they can hear me, I'll go back on the slides, and you don't need to see me. Okay. No. So the important thing is you can hear me though, if you can check that on the webcast. Okay. So my first port of call, I want to do a theoretical framework for you, okay? What I want to do is I'm going to keep it very simple today, right? So I'm very much into what's called the social welfare theorems in economics, or general equilibrium theory, or the first and second welfare theorem, and what we can learn from that, okay? But one way in the 60s when this was taught, people used to use the Robinson Crusoe economy as the example, and I can explain to you what it's about. Later, they used what's called the Edward Box, who's actually an Irish economist. You might not have known that. But let me talk about the Robinson Crusoe economy, okay? So Robinson Crusoe, in case people don't know around the world, right, it's just a story about somebody getting stranded on an island on their own, okay? And the thing about, obviously, when you're on your own, nothing to do, the obvious thing you would do is set up an economic, political, and social system. I mean, that's clear. So you'd stand there and you'd go, you know, I'm bored. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a company, and I'm going to own the company, and I'm the shareholder, and I'm the one who's going to buy the factors of production. The first person I'm going to hire is me, of course, and then I'm going to pay for raw materials and et cetera, right? So you sort out the production side. And then as a household, you go, I'm a household, so I'm the person, I create the demand, I'm the one who does the consumption, right? And then what you do is you bring the household and the company together, and you have these nice theorems about efficiency, about equity, and I'm going to talk about sustainability in a minute, okay? Now, the key thing here is that it's kind of obvious that Robinson Crusoe, like in household behavior, in company behavior, and given that he's the self-elected, you know, president of the country, and maybe he sets up a bureaucratic and a parliamentary system, that it's clear that that person would naturally internalize any harm on each of those pillars, right? So if there was something going on the company side, you wouldn't just try to overprice or to do something to the household, right? You wouldn't try to kick out that shareholder, have shareholder concentrated into one person, etc., right? So it was very natural that the value set that you'd naturally internalize your decision-making as a company and as a household and even as a government on yourself, okay? Acting as one, okay? And in some respects, the SDG agenda is asking us to do this. It's asking us to somehow, basically, to act as somehow one household, one company, one government, one planet, right? In the sense that if there's activities going on the economic side, that it clearly is not creating damage and harm on society, on the environment, on the governance side, and vice versa, okay? Now, the only problem with the traditional and there's mathematics behind this Robinson Crusoe economy, is that it doesn't allow for intergenerational considerations. So the story goes he meets man Friday, but I'll have to change that story because now he's going to meet woman Friday, right? Because they have to have a family. Why? Because I want them to start thinking about sustainability issues. I want them to start thinking that I want the standard of living that we have in terms of our economic side and our social outcomes, and even on the environmental side, they would naturally want clean water. They would naturally not want to pollute what's around them, etc. But they would want to leave the island for their children in the same condition as they got it. Okay, and they would naturally set up a family business that they'd want sustainable and to have the same sort of incomes and outcomes that they would have now themselves. Okay, so suddenly the value setting, or so you would naturally internalize the damage that you're causing to strangers or to people in the future, right? Okay, so you can extend this Robinson Crusoe not to a man but to a family, and you would hope, even though in the post 2030 negotiations you were not allowed to put family in the documentation, and I'm using it here, but the family would be there to be sustained both on the environmental, social, and the economic side. Okay, you can go, there's maths behind this, beautiful maths behind all of these things, but what I'm trying to get to is putting it another way, that sometimes when you're in Holland, there's a drive to be middle class, as they call it, right? But what they really mean is that when they look at the corporate economic side, is that everybody should have access to a decent job with a good enough pay. Everybody, income is not just wage income. You should also have an equal share in the, say, the companies, the profits of companies as a shareholder. You should also have an equal share in the land. So if there's dividends from the land, that's spread equally across the households as well. So the whole sort of idea is that suddenly the interest of companies, because of the fragmentation of ownership, of the factors of production and the companies themselves, they would give a decent wage, they would have good conditions, and you would basically get more or less equal access across all the returns to land, to labor, to capital. Okay, they'd all hopefully elect an egalitarian government that would be democratic and would do that for them, and they would also have obviously a focus on, they would not want environmental damage, they would want to deal with water, they would want to deal with air, etc. Okay, so this is the whole idea of a society that suddenly wants to act like one. It basically wants to ensure that somehow we're moving forward where there's a win-win on economics, society, and environment, and on governance. Okay, and that's the thing that underpins the SDGs. If you want to go further on this, the next debate is if you want to look at SDSN EDU, there is a MOOC, an online course at the moment going on the encyclical letter by Pope Francis. And what's interesting in this, because it's really, this is written for multi-faiths, it's written by scientists, it's also written by, obviously, the religious. But their focus is very much on, yes, they didn't actually say this, but I think they probably meant to say this. There are heads of state signing this document in September. But at the end of the day, people are in companies, people are in governments, people are in households, people are the ones who interact with the planet and with the environment and with animals, etc. Right? So there has to be individual responsibility for this. Right? You can't just say, well, we leave it to governments, they'll sign it, they'll work out how to do it, because at the end of the day, this is very much a human agency story about how you, in a religious sense, interact with your neighbor. The problem is that now, with the way human agency has gone, not only can we affect people in our closest neighborhood, but through globalizations and technologies and social media, we can damage distant strangers very easily and knowingly damage them, right? And this is in our power, and this is something new. And so for a Catholic, you have a new set of sins now, right? So you can actually go, I didn't recycle, I bought these clothes with child labor in them, these are now sins, right? The other sin is that you can actually damage people who aren't born yet, right? That you knowingly, by changing the climate and not addressing these sort of issues, climate change, you are knowingly causing harm to future generations, right? With human agency. And the question is, they outline exactly how this is done, through the science, and they do actually have a chapter on how, as an individual, you can address this, okay? But the idea here is the old saying about the snowflake never feels responsible for what the avalanche did, right? But this is not, this basically articulates this very nicely, and it's completely consistent with the first, second welfare theorem, and let's call it the third one that brings in intertemporal or intergenerational environmental issues, okay? So one of the big challenges we really have is how do we align the value sets of companies, civil society, governments, because they all have different primary targets. One wants to get re-elected, one wants to make money in the short term maybe, the other wants to be happy and nutritious and healthy, and so we have a problem in the sense, and that the actors, the people, there seems to be a concentration of people in companies, so maybe it's only a couple of thousand, not representing the 6 billion. There seems to be a similar problem in the political sphere, and even in those who represent civil society, there doesn't seem to be a kind of comprehensive representation of this idea of working as one within these elements, okay? So if we are theoretically concerned about, so the issue that you have to make up your mind with is that, do we drive towards policies and incentives that actually create a bottom-up swell that unite these different factions and people as they operate in different spheres? Can that be done without government? Or do we need government? Do we actually need the government to come in and basically, because of planetary boundaries and because of certain issues, legislate? Right? Legislate against discrimination, legislate on the use of natural resources, on pollution, etc., and how that's going to be done, okay? So either we work out how we do it for ourselves, or if we can't, maybe we have to accept that somebody's going to come in and legislate and make us do it, okay? Or not, but that's the decision. The next thing I want to look at is, before I go on to, I just want to look at, in some of the goals, I was at a session in Geneva with UNIDO, okay? I think it's Geneva is UNIDO, right? I get confused, but I think it's, they're in Geneva. And the first thing was, UNIDO as an agency was happy because it said, you know what, unlike the MDG project, in the SDG project, we actually have goals. Industry is mentioned. Right? It's absolutely mentioned, right? And within that, some of the big issues for industrial development are in that goal on economic growth. So for example, diversification of jobs. We've got to move, it can't be rain-fed agriculture. We've got to move up into agribusiness, into manufacturing, up into exporting, up into services, internationally traded services. So we've got to diversify the employment structure. We've got to, underneath, make sure that we're getting small and medium enterprises going, supporting all the bigger companies, etc. We've got to get the microfinance going. And we also have to, there's global value chains out there that we have to latch onto. We have to learn how to do that. So basically, they make a story, which is a good story, is that most of us got out of poverty, particularly the Asian tigers. We got out with aggressive industrialization. And they show how to do that. And those elements of industrialization are explicitly outlined in those goals without any reference to social or environmental issues. So they would kind of go, step one, let us industrialize. Let us move up the value chain. Let us create the jobs. Because without that, we can't even talk about tax revenue. We can't even talk about inclusive growth or sustainable growth, right? Because we have to have some form of growth, right? The only problem I have with that, of course, is that there's John Sutton, who's in the London School of Economics, right? He wrote this paper a long time ago about natural oligopolies. But I think, again, we don't have time to do it here. But what I like about it is the primitives of the consumer, because what actually drives the companies in this model, or the concentration of the market, or the pricing in the market, or the R&D in the market, as you'll see, is the primitives of the consumers. And there's just two primitives. One is that consumers have different incomes. So let me think about OECD, high income, non-OECD, low income. The other thing is that they have different taste structures. One has a taste for high quality right? If it was food, maybe it's a taste for chocolate, ice cream, pizza, while the taste is quite different in the rest of the world, okay? And with those very simple demand conditions, he asked the companies to compete on kind of R&D and advertising and distribution, which is like the quality aspect, and then to compete on price and to see what happens to the evolution of the industry. And what he finds is that in these sort of conditions where you have these income inequalities and a taste for quality, you will see what's called natural oligopolies will just emerge everywhere. You'll have 3 or 4 companies dominating on your value chain, either on distribution or in retail, and this will just be a common feature right across the world, right? And it's a question we've got to ask ourselves. Why is there only 2 or 3 companies in carbonated drinks? Why is there only 2 or 3 companies in pharmaceuticals, in food, commodities, etc.? Right? This is not natural, right? This is driven by household behavior and by the company's strategies and pricing. The consequences are, unfortunately, I'm not going to do this, but just consequences is that even when you're looking at one big aspect of the SDG project is we need lots of money in R&D and technology to understand how we can move into employment and different types of industrial structures that are more environmentally favorable and socially inclusive. And to do that, obviously the R&D has to be targeted at that, right? At the moment, most of the R&D is targeted at the OECD, at the rich, for stuff that they want, like drugs for old people and such like, right? We're not getting a huge amount of money flowing into, let's call it bottom of the pyramid or social sustainability issues, okay? The other thing is that what do natural oligopolies do well? What they do is they restrict output to get a higher price, right? So they'll naturally drive waste, they'll naturally cut back output to get higher prices. So it's not surprising that if we have a lot of global trade and global finance and global R&D targeting the rich or the OECD markets and trying to keep the prices up, what happens is that the rest of the world will suffer, right? We saw this with food prices or commodity prices that, you know, when this sort of activity is happening, it has social consequences, right? It's going to have less employment and it's going to have huge social consequences and also environmental consequences, because if you look at one of the dialogue briefs for they're interesting, in the summit, they have 6 teams or 6 dialogue briefs which are up on the Sustainable Development Platform, and they talk about inequality and climate, etc. But one of the things they stress is that with industrial development, the resource use of the industrial base at the moment is just way too high. We cannot have similar use by the developing world if they're to come up to our levels and think that we can stay within planetary boundaries. That is not possible, right? So we basically are using natural resources pretty much for free, using the, you know, as a source, but also as a sink, a lot of waste, a lot of pollution, and that this is not sustainable, right? Again, I would say I could link these global value chains are probably, you know, 80 or 90% responsible for what's happening to natural resources and pollution, and also what's happening to global inequality and inequality in societies, right? So it's not a standard view maybe, but before people used to say, you know, in some ways economic growth is a good thing. It creates jobs, it gives you a tax base, it pulls people out of poverty, etc. But I think the view now is that when you look at it from a global picture point of view, most people do understand that these value chains are driving high prices, driving inequalities, and are causing severe environmental problems, okay? And they have to be dealt with, okay? So this is a challenge, right? So how do we meet the challenge, okay? So one is that we have what we have, the industrial base and the industrial structures we have, and we want to move forward. One is to say, well, can companies, without much interference from, let's say, governments or civil society, can they address these issues themselves? Okay. So one approach is corporates themselves, and here we have, for example, signing up to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. You know, a lot of corporates have stepped aside and said, you know, this is silly making these short-run profits and businesses going out. Like, we need much more sustainability. We want to stay in markets for longer. If you want to be a good product in the medium, longer term, we have to be socially and environmentally responsible. Otherwise, we'll lose our product. It's not going to work. And we have to come up with investment strategies that are more medium to long term, which give us a rate of return that's competitive, but is consistent with environmental and socially good. Favorable outcomes, at least. Okay, so they call this incorporate the environment, social, and governance issues into investment analysis. Okay, so it kind of is out of self-interest a little bit. If you walk in as IKEA into a country to source out some wood or whatever you're doing, and you cause governments to be corrupt, you're accused of child labor, you're accused of water damaging, polluting water. This is not good for, in this day and age with social media, so this is not good for your product, right? So it's kind of self-motivated a bit that, we have to, when we go in to get our raw materials, have to be a bit more aware that we have to be, responsible for the governance issues, the social, environmental issues, okay? The other side of it is the Global Compact, UN's Global Compact. So what I would say is that I prefer the UN principles responsible principles, because at least they're trying to create a social environmental good. They're trying to create a positive linkage, right? What a lot of these say is that companies have to behave. In other words, that you've got to be careful about human rights abuses. You have to not use child labor. You've got to be very, much more responsible on damaging the environment. Like, obviously, Principle 9, developing environmental technology, is more positive, and don't work against corruption and not contribute to it by, using bribes, etc. Right? But this is more, to me, this is more about human rights abuses, and it's saying that companies, should avoid these things, which we clearly would say that's true, but they're just putting that down on paper. So it's like the level 1 of behaving yourself when you're actually in the global value chains, while the other one is more level 2, where you actually create positives, that you do some good for social and environmental outcomes. So the issue for me, though, is that, can we leave the private sector or the financial markets and, say, big multinationals on their own, working with the UN system or working with others, but can they themselves correct their values and their objectives and learn to operate globally, generating, and certainly not harming social and environmental outcomes? Okay, we'll come back to that, because I think maybe they can, but that has to be in partnership, I think, with civil society and government and other things. There has to be, that's only one side of the story, right? Because there has to be an alignment of values everywhere, right? So it's one thing creating the investment flows and the finance for this. There has to be a demand for this as well, and we can maybe have a look at how that's done. Before that, I want to look at, again, maybe the possibility that industrial policy could play a big role at a nation state. Okay, so industrial policy in its traditional manner was basically the government going out, competing to get multinationals or investment into their country, and also to help investment, like small firm startups in their own country, or to get companies exporting in their own country. But it's very much about attracting investment, right? And they would do this, they would say, well, why are companies not coming here? Why are companies not starting up? Why are companies not exporting? They said there had to be some sort of government intervention. So they'd come in with different types of supports. The horizontal supports would be those, well, let's put them into industrial parks and make sure they've got the water, the electricity, the roads to port, the tax breaks, reduce, just create a good, what's called generic investment climate for them, so that it's attractive for money to flow, or for the companies to come into the parks or the designated zones or areas. The vertical supports are more tricky, because then you've got to pick winners. You've got to say, we're going to target pharmaceuticals, computing, food. Therefore, we have to have the graduates and the skills and the machineries and the small businesses to actually support the nature of those products, right? So you really then are targeting particular products and you're trying to support them, okay? So this was all about competition. This was trying to get up the value chain, trying to bring in multinationals, trying to bring in investment, and that was the key focus of the investment criteria was just value added or money. Okay, things changed a little bit, and this goes back to Hirschman. Hirschman, in his work, said, you know, there is an opportunity with industrial policy to change the investment criteria. And what he did was, you know, if you're successful at this, let's say Ireland was successful at this, you know, you can pick and choose what companies come into your parks. So what you can do is say, well, you know, let's say we'll pick you if and only if you can have your corporate tax break, you can have all the supports, the golf courses, everything you want, but there's going to be now, you're going to be judged in different criteria. We want to see labor intensity. We want jobs. We want jobs for our people, and you could put a gender quota. You could actually say you've got to contribute to pensions, to insurance, right? So what this means is that some of the value added of that activity is flowing into your society. I know it's a bit at the top, but it's happening. The other thing you can ask for is linkages. When you're outsourcing, you've got to use domestic companies, right? You cannot use your own companies. You cannot import, right? So you can use as, you can basically set up a whole, what I call more social criteria, that we want to start shifting the value added out of that activity into households, right? Into small businesses, into households, and into people, okay? So that wouldn't surprise you. So then it's not going to surprise you that when I was thinking about a new sustainable development industrial policy, I started, this is in the Global Sustainable Development Report 2015, I started as a policy brief, I started to think about, you know, do countries have industrial agencies? And the answer is yes. Every country in the world has an industrial agency, right? What are they primarily doing at the moment? What they're primarily doing at the moment is trying to attract in investment, okay? But can we write, as part of regulatory or an industrial policy, can that investment, particularly when you're giving them industrial parks and roads to ports, and you're giving them young people at low wages, etc., surely you can demand something in return. And maybe what you can demand in return is a much more clever set of socially, like looking at the targets of the SDGs, some of the social targets, and certainly the environmental targets that are there, okay? So the thing I want you to imagine is that, let's say through the company, I did a survey where I had this, had social, environmental, and economic criteria, and I was able to survey the companies, and I had it like micro data, and I was basically able to understand my natural resources, understand the sort of clean air and water ambience that I want, the standards that I need in these industrial parks, understand the sort of social targets I wanted in terms of social protection and health insurance, all these things, right? No gender quotas, etc. And I wrote them into investment criteria, and I was able to monitor them. What you could start seeing is the evolution of an industrial base, particularly over time. You might want to grandfather companies that were there, but over time, you would start to seeing the emergence of industrial base that, yes, it's trying to get onto value chains. Yes, it's trying to create linkages to small and medium enterprises, trying to create all the value added and diversification of products that we want to target. But in doing so, it would have to respect all of the social criteria and environmental criteria that we talk about in the goals that we'll have a look at in a second. Okay? Yeah.
Heads up on time.
Yeah, I'm nearly done.
We have another 6 minutes to go.
Yeah.
We have some bunch of really interesting questions on Google Hangout.
Okay.
So
good.
can we end around 9:20?
Okay.
Thanks.
Good. So questions that Sutton starts asks, even though he does industrial mapping speech to Ethiopia, Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia, is like, do we actually have industrial maps of countries? And the answer is no. What I mean is like where the companies are, like with a geocode. Do we actually have data on their social environmental impacts? Or is there any way that we can look at their economic data, but look at the society around them, or what they contribute to the economy, what they're doing to natural resources, what they're doing to air and water pollution, etc.? And the answer is no, right? But I think part of this, you know, what we call the data revolution, the SDG project, is that governments now have to be capable of having a sustainable development agency or an industrial agency that is able to, promote industrial development, but make sure it has the data and the incentives to ensure the companies that are there are being socially inclusive and environmentally responsible. So it's like taking those UN principles from the UN Principles for Responsible Investment and the UN Global Compact principles and saying companies have no choice. Like, if you come into these industrial parks, you can do your business, but you have to adhere to these things. You will be monitored and you will be punished if you don't, okay? And we have the ability to do that. At the moment, we don't have the ability to do that because we don't have industrial mappings. We don't have the data that integrates the economic, the social, and the environmental side to be able to monitor this properly. But we could have. Finally, in terms of the Global Compact, I want you to think about, again, we can allow companies to decide that they're not going to have child labor, or they will hire women, or whatever the thing, or give access to shareholding, etc. But governments themselves can ensure with different types of policies that they do make sure there's no restrictive access in terms of ownership of land, ownership of companies, access to good jobs by any dimension, whether gender or any other dimension. Okay, and the other thing is that it should be mandatory in any country that when people are in jobs that they should have a social insurance of some. So if they have an environmental, a health, or they have an economic shock, they lose their job, they have maybe 6 months to a year to cope and to actually find something else. And then again, this is a big outcome on ADIS, was that there's going to be money for a big social insurance or social protection packages. Okay, partnerships. Okay, I want to go to the end. What I was going to do here with partnerships is saying that it's one thing to get finance and companies up and running to do sustainable development, but I think there has to be a demand for this as well. And what I mean by that is that governments, when they actually put money into government procurement projects like roads and stuff, or into universities for research, or into NGOs or nonprofits, or even part of their industrial policies, they should have these social environmental criteria. You don't get the money, you don't get the contract unless you adhere to these principles. That means the R&D, the finance, and the companies upstream will have to think about this, right? If they're to win the contracts, okay? But this does mean quite a bit of regulatory ability, that the government has to have the ability to understand which companies are indeed being socially and environmentally responsible. You need the data and you need the capacity in government to do this. Okay. So very quickly, what I want you to do on your own is to look through the goals. Yes, social insurance is definitely there, and access to factors of production is definitely in goal 1, but there's not a lot of mention of other things. If you look at goal 8, what I've done here, this is the only mention of the environment. The blue or the purple is when we're talking about extending beyond economic criteria, but it's normally a job, a good job, a job for the youth. It doesn't really go beyond that, okay? Then when we go into infrastructure, that's social, that's environmental. The rest is pure traditional industrial development in goal 9, right? Do R&D, build your infrastructure, etc., right? Then luckily we've goal 10, because every one of those things, particularly if it's imposed on companies, whether they do it themselves or we impose it on it, they're all social. And then if we go to goal 12, they're all environmental, right? But so if I'm to look at the goals together, then I know I have an integrated approach. But if I was to go, I'm going to pick and choose my goals, then it's not in a sustainable development program. Then we're back to silos and we're back to pure economic development, pure social, etc. So the last thing to think about, and then I'll stop. All of this, one of the things that there was a big battle, and you'll see it in the stakeholders material if you bother to look at it, to put in the concept of planetary boundaries into the post-2030 agenda, okay? This was purposely not in. And the reason is that there is a sense that we can still grow. We can all grow. We can all keep going the way we're going, and that we're well inside the planetary boundaries, okay? But if we decide that this is not true, that even with this inclusive and sustainable economic growth, even if it's as good as we can make it, right? If we are not inside planetary boundaries, we will have to do something a bit more catastrophic. What we'll have to do is put sustainability first, which means is if you're in California with the groundwater, you go, look, we're getting the groundwater basin up to this level and this quality. The almond farmers, I don't care if you don't have enough water. It's not my business. First objective is sustainability of the resource. Equity and economics can optimize off it, okay? If that is going to happen, this is going to introduce structural change beyond belief. If you really come down hard on planetary boundaries, then your whole vision of economic development and social development will be completely different, okay? At the moment, we're business as usual, we're going to augment it and try and make a transition and do things on the margin, and it'll all be okay. But that's efficiency first, building in equity, sustainability issues. But what if you have to put sustainability first? Then what are the implications for economic and social development? And that, to me, this is something that this whole lecture and these goals are off the table if this is true, right? That we have to do this first. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Yes, he'll be answering the questions on Google Hangout now. Just give me 1 second to pull them up.
Somebody see? Can you see the question?
Yes. Okay, so you select the question you're answering. Oh,
Okay.
I just did it,
Okay.
so that's the question.
You could read out the question.
Okay. So this is, I think I'm being biased. This is from Dublin, but I didn't click it. From Connor Gavin. Why do we see a drive towards urbanization in a development setting when many times poverty in an urban setting is a serious issue that is not being well managed? Yeah. Okay. So okay, one of the things that's been pointed out, obviously with the goals, and we have one on cities, right, was since most of us are driving towards cities and urbanization, that we really haven't thought out fully the impact, say, of urban slums, or the impact it has on health or education or this project, okay? Now, to be fair, the goals does have a standalone goal and has its targets on sustainable and inclusive cities. And there's a kind of a unique approach to that. And in fact, we have, SDSN has a major conference here during the summit on the mayors from cities around the world who are basically, you know, including New York, trying to take the lead on this, that we have, you know, to think a bit more carefully, I mean, both in modern or kind of developed cities and in emerging cities, on the role of the way we think of poverty and the way we think of social and economic issues and how they interact. So the answer is that I would say that traditionally, we liked to think, like in the MDG project, this is not always true, but we like to think that we could identify poverty. We like to say it's in that country, in that region, with those structural features, and then we felt we could go in and solve it with projects and community interventions, etc. The reality about poverty is that it was never actually as isolated as you thought it was, right? So there's a map I can show you of Thailand before the MDG project and after, where the poverty was, and they more or less got rid of poverty. And what you'll see is that poverty is everywhere. People are in urban and rural areas, they can suffer from a health episode. They don't have insurance, they go into poverty, like something like HIV, AIDS, and malaria, right? They can, you know, lose their job over this, like the rain doesn't fall, the harvest doesn't come. They can be hungry for 6 months up to a year, and they're in poverty for that period. So poverty is a bit more transitional than you think. It's in a lot more people than you think, and it was never easily targeted, right? So I think what's interesting about the SDG agenda, from my reading of it, is that really it's a much more comprehensive agenda, in the sense of realizing that it's about prevention and treatment. It can be in urban and rural areas. It's a global issue. It's a national, it's a community issue. And I think there is a realization that we are getting away from the stereotyping that there's a billion people out there in poverty. We know who they are, we know their families, we know their structures, and we know the sort of remedies for them, because that's not true. Poverty is a very transitional thing. There's probably up to 5.8 billion without any form of social insurance or protection, who all are experiencing some spell in poverty at some time. And that's, so the agenda, that's why with social protection and all the agenda, to me, is implicit in the agenda. It's a bit more comprehensive, right, in that respect, okay? But I do think the remedies, say in New York, to be environmentally and socially inclusive are very different to Dar es Salaam. I mean, we've a different approach to a city or an urban setting. Maybe I didn't answer that, but let's see. Elisa, so in my experience, developing countries do not have the bargaining power to demand SDG standards of companies or countries that plan to invest. For example, in Ethiopia, many investors are from China, where there is an SDG environment challenge as well. Yeah, okay. So this is a very obvious critique of my so-called national level sort of industrial policy, right? Because it's all very fine, take example of Ethiopia, to step up and go, you know, he's right, we're going to have a comprehensive industrial policy. And then when they're trying to bid, you know, competing with Kenya, competing with their neighbors, when they're trying to bid for investment, suddenly they have these social environmental criteria that the other countries do not have. So therefore the investors don't come, or they basically move to the next country, right? And, you know, so potentially you can lose out very badly, right? But the same goes for, let's say, China and natural resources, you kind of feel. But what I would say about this is that one thing you got to watch out for is that a lot of people, when they look at criteria around social and environmental, actually, there's people already in the WTO from the developing world seeing this as an anti-competitive step, right? Because what it does is, if you start to put this sort of criteria, it actually, like particularly on, let's say, carbon footprints or water footprints or anything, it actually gives an advantage to the local. It means that local markets are basically will be supplied by local suppliers, right? Because they're more likely to have this sort of criteria. And this would not be fair to the multinationals, right? So, and they're already lawyers driving up, potentially going to fight this as some sort of anti-competitive movement, like to bring back environmental and social criteria, right? So it's not always clear that this isn't a disadvantage. That's what I'm trying to say. And particularly, say, when you're dealing with China, China comes in for natural resources. It's the responsibility of a country to extract the rents for the current and what they call the scarcity rent for the current and the future generations. Too often, I would say that in the bargaining with China, they might get a football stadium, they might get a road to port, but they could have got so much more, right? And they, yes, should insist on hiring local workers or training, or should insist on value chains or small or medium business as suppliers, okay? Because in the end, you have the natural resource, so you have the power. You may not think you have, but you do. This then feeds into the problem really of bad governance, right? So I think, in all honesty, I think this critique is more to do with, can a country legitimately have a bureaucratic structure that can run an industrial policy and the ability to do that. Most governments in the developing world don't. They don't have a strong mind is looking for short-term gains and money and for political cycles, and that can empower the Chinese companies or the multinationals to come in and do what they want, etc. So I do think there is a potentially like you can say, can your industrial policy be benevolent, truly benevolent? And who are these civil servants or bureaucrats or governments that would run this? Would they really run this? Would they not bend to multinationals or bend to the interest of elites in society for good jobs, etc. Right? So, and I think so. It's a good question. I don't think there's a simple answer. Next question: how can some of the household goals be accomplished while still being culturally sensitive to a specific culture? Okay, this is a good question. Okay, one of the questions that Jeffrey Sachs always gets when he talks about goal-based development is that the goals should be general enough in some ways and targets general enough that, you know, countries like communities and cities and nation states and regions, they should really come up with their own way to achieve them. There is nobody really saying what the governance structure should look like or how exactly you should actually achieve these goals, right? And I think that's why it's particularly important if you look at the follow-up and review, and particularly you look at the nation state, it actually clearly states indigenous. It says you have to come up with your sustainable development strategy with indigenous people, with private sector, you know, with the government, etc. So it's clearly saying that all countries are different. They all have different cultures, and they'll have their own way of actually doing an implementation strategy and a follow-up strategy. And that's why the follow-up and review strategy is very detailed at the UN level, but down at the national level, it's kind of open. And that's for that reason, actually, right? Another question: although there are no magical solutions to achievement of the sustainable development, as each country has its own peculiarities, which of the pillars of state development would be more relevant for the developing countries for the Caribbean region? Okay. So again, SIDS had a big say. Like when you're actually in the negotiations, it is kind of interesting how even though groups can be bigger or smaller than each other, and even allowing, for the first time, allowing major stakeholders like scientists in the room in the negotiation, you only had one seat and they had 193 seats. I mean, the power of ideas are very strong, you know, and particularly those who are, you know, suffering from climate change and are clearly the ones when the ice melts that their cities and their areas are going underwater. They're the ones that will be listened to, right? And there is no doubt that for certain countries, the environment, which we hadn't done today because I was focusing on the economic goals, but the environmental goals, particularly around water and oceans, etc., is fundamentally important to the SIDS. And there's no doubt about that, okay? But it should be as important to everybody else, but their sequencing would be a lot different, okay? But this is what I mean by when we're actually faced with the realities of natural resource and environmental sustainability, where, you know, humans have to realize that we need water, clean water, air, and nutritious food and kind of land, you know, nutritious land. If we don't have that, we have no sustainability. So when that is threatened, you know, we have to drop all our ideas about society and economics. That is out the window, right? And I do think that countries like in the Caribbean have a greater understanding of that because they are faced with a kind of a catastrophic environmental situation. It's much more real for them maybe than it is for us, even though it is as serious for us, but we're not taking it seriously. Okay. Okay. In line with the discussion on the feasibility of achieving these goals, why were the goals framed in a way requiring success, ending hunger, ending poverty, instead of framing as pursuing the end of hunger and poverty or similar? I don't really get that. Somebody get that? Requiring ending hunger. Okay. Well, I can answer it. You're feeding into one of my pet dislikes of this process, right? So, this is the idea of zero tolerance versus a transition period, right? So one of the things that I noticed in all the targets, and you got to remember, the Open Working Group produced these targets, and they were really untouched for about 2 years, okay, for political reasons. But one thing I did not like was the thing by 2030. This is everywhere, by 2020 sometimes, but by 2030. So that means is that we have an agenda where no one is to be left behind by 2030. So it's perfectly okay between January 2015 and the next 15 years to leave everybody behind. But on 2030, we will have nobody left behind, okay? So then I fought, and you'll see a little note up, and they kindly, in one of the paragraphs, between now and 2030, which was in paragraph, say, 22 or something, so they kind of say, like, the targets are saying that, but so the issue is that a lot of developing countries kind of go, it's not realistic for us to end poverty tomorrow. We can't put all our resources into ending poverty. We've got to build our economy. We've got to build our infrastructures. You know, we have to have a tolerance for a certain level of poverty. We can't be told there's no poverty, right? And some people like to see targets, like to see, well, in 5 years, that's the target, you know, because it's reasonable. 5 years, this is, you know, and that helps management. You know, this comes, like, these are managers that come up with this, okay? Like key performance indicators or something, and to basically transition to an end of poverty, right? But for me, I actually think this is wrong. I think we should have zero tolerance. I think it is absolutely unacceptable in the MDGs to say that we should cut poverty in half by 2015 in the year, and this was, you know, in the year 2000, okay? Because it opens the question, which half? Maybe you, this half die, you live, okay? Or I'm going to deal with you guys because it's going to be cheaper to bring you out of poverty because you've got good governments and good institutions, okay? So you're in, you're out, okay? This is what it begs, right? You either are human and you respect every individual and everybody's individual right to development, or you don't, right? And you should not have them in internationally negotiated summits where you explicitly say that you're okay with poverty, right? So I understand why people would feel this is too difficult for us to end poverty now and to have zero tolerance. But I think that should be the ambition. And then do your best to get there as fast as you can and do everything you can. And of course, I'll understand if you don't get there, but you should really have the ambition of zero poverty. You should not have it tailored through time. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I think Paul's done a really great job in drawing attention to, while focusing on the economic aspects of the SDGs, looking at the challenges of what does it mean to have, you know, no one left behind, social inclusion, and the planetary boundaries / environmental sustainability. And I think some of the questions also referred to the scale effects, kind of households, communities, to kind of nation states, and the responsibility challenges. So now what we're going to do is, guys, we're going to break. This is the end of the global classroom. And what we'll now do is have at Columbia, and we'll have our own set of discussions that Paul is going to lead out on. And so thank you. And now definitely for some of you, good night.
Unfortunately, there was no video. That was probably my fault. I hit the wrong button.